By the 9th hour of the flight, the air inside the cabin felt tired. Not thin, exactly, just overused, as if every breath had already belonged to someone else before it reached your lungs. At 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, somewhere between New York and Madrid, Priscilla Morgan sat rigid in her seat, her shoulder pressed against the narrow curve of the window, her forearm resting along the armrest where the vibration of the aircraft hummed faintly into her bones. She hadn't slept. That wasn't unusual anymore. This was her 83rd flight that year as a medical device consultant, and somewhere around Flight 50, the romance of international travel had evaporated completely. Airports blurred together, hotel rooms smelled the same, time zones stacked on top of one another until mornings and evenings lost their meaning. What remained were swollen ankles, stiff necks, and the persistent ache of being everywhere except where she needed to be. Her phone rested face up on her lap, screen dark but heavy with unanswered messages. She didn't need to open them to know what they contained. A reminder from the hospital billing department back in Baltimore. A follow-up from her landlord about next month's rent. A calendar alert she'd been avoiding for weeks. Dad, cardiology consult. Priscilla closed her eyes and let her head rest back against the seat. The hum of the engines vibrated through her skull. She counted her breaths the way her therapist had once suggested. Slow in, slower out. But her thoughts refused to settle. She thought about her father. About the way his hands shook now when he tried to button his shirts. About how fiercely independent he'd always been, and how much it cost him to ask for help. She thought about the promotion she was chasing, the one that promised stability, but demanded even more travel. She thought about how tired she was of being strong, simply because there was no one else to be. The plane jolted lightly, turbulence rippling through the cabin. A few passengers gasped. A child laughed. Somewhere behind her, a tray table snapped shut. Priscilla adjusted her seatbelt and exhaled. That was when the scream cut through the cabin. It wasn't loud in the dramatic sense, not a shriek, not hysteria, but it carried a sharpness that made every muscle in her body tense at once. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. "What happened?" someone whispered. Flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, or their practiced calm not quite masking the urgency in their steps. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin as passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, craning their necks to see over one another. "He just fell," a man said from a few rows ahead. One second he was standing, the next. Priscilla was already on her feet. She didn't remember deciding to move. Her body acted before her mind caught up, instincts sharpened by years of navigating hospitals and emergency rooms for work. She stepped into the aisle just as a flight attendant knelt beside a man collapsed near the center row. He lay awkwardly on his side, one arm twisted beneath him, the other stretched out as if he'd tried to catch himself on the way down. His suit, dark, tailored, expensive, was wrinkled now, jacket pulled open at the chest. His face had gone frighteningly pale, a sheen of sweat beading along his temples. Even unconscious, there was something striking about him. Not just his features, though they were sharp, composed, the kind that looked deliberate, but the way people unconsciously gave him space, as if some unspoken rule applied to him even now. "Is there a doctor on board?" a flight attendant called, her voice steady but tight. A middle-aged woman pushed forward, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'm a physician," she said. She knelt, fingers pressing into the man's wrist, then his neck. Her expression shifted almost immediately. That was when Priscilla felt the first true flicker of fear. The doctor glanced up. "I need the emergency medical kit." Another attendant sprinted away. Passengers murmured nervously. Someone prayed under their breath. Someone else complained loudly about the delay, then fell silent when the doctor shot them a look sharp enough to cut. The man on the floor groaned faintly. His chest rose, fell, too fast, too shallow. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "We have a medical emergency on board. If there is anyone with AB-negative blood, please identify yourself to the crew immediately." The words landed like a weight. Silence followed. Priscilla felt her heartbeat quicken, her palms dampened. For a moment, no one moved. Her grandmother's voice surfaced in her mind, unbidden and clear. "That blood of yours is rare, baby. Don't forget that. It's a gift, but it's also a responsibility." "I'm AB negative," Priscilla heard herself say. The words felt unreal, as if they'd come from somewhere outside her body. The doctor looked up at her, relief and hesitation warring across her face. "You're sure?" she asked. Priscilla nodded. She donated regularly. She knew her type, as well as she knew her own name. The doctor exhaled slowly. "We don't have proper equipment for a transfusion," she said carefully. "This would be improvised. There are risks." Priscilla looked down at the man on the floor, at the grayish cast of his skin, at the way his chest struggled to keep pace with his heartbeat. "And if we do nothing?" she asked. The doctor didn't answer. That was enough. They moved quickly after that. The medical kit was stripped of anything remotely useful. A researcher seated in business class offered additional supplies. The doctor explained the risks in clipped, professional tones as Priscilla rolled up her sleeve, her hands steadier than she felt. 20 minutes later, she watched her blood flow through clear tubing into the arm of a man she didn't know. The setup was crude, the margin for error terrifyingly thin. Her arm tingled where the needle sat, a dull ache radiating outward. Lightheadedness crept in, curling at the edges of her vision, but she focused on the slow rhythm of his breathing instead. In, out, in. Gradually his chest rose more evenly. Color returned, faint but unmistakable. Only then did Priscilla allow herself to notice the details. The watch on his wrist, simple in design, unmistakably custom. The absence of calluses on his hands. The careful grooming that spoke of a life untouched by physical labor. "Who are you?" she wondered. "Where were you going? Who would be waiting for you if this flight never landed?" When the doctor finally removed the line and wrapped Priscilla's arm in gauze, her knees trembled as she stood. A flight attendant guided her back to her seat, murmuring thanks, offering water she barely tasted. As the plane resumed its steady hum, Priscilla stared at the seat back in front of her, adrenaline slowly draining away. She had no reason to believe this moment would follow her beyond the flight. No reason to imagine that somewhere down the line a door would open, or a name would be spoken, or a truth would surface that would turn her understanding of that day completely upside down. She closed her eyes. She never expected to see him again. If you believe one moment can change everything, hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. This helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. And while Priscilla believed the worst and best of that flight was behind her, fate had already begun writing the next chapter. For a while, Priscilla expected something to happen. A tap on the shoulder. A flight attendant returning with news. A man waking up and asking her name. None of it came. The remainder of the flight passed in a strange, muted haze. The man who had collapsed was moved carefully toward the front of the cabin, shielded from curious eyes by drawn curtains and the quiet authority of the crew. The doctor checked on him twice more, then once on Priscilla, nodding with professional approval before moving on. No one spoke to her after that. Not really. Passengers glanced her way, some with gratitude, others with open curiosity, but no one interrupted the fragile bubble she found herself inside. She stayed seated, hands folded in her lap, staring at the faint smear of clouds beyond the window as the adrenaline slowly drained from her body. By the time the plane began its descent into Madrid, the weight of exhaustion hit her all at once. Her arm ached where the needle had been. Her head throbbed faintly, and beneath it all, a quiet disbelief settled in her chest. That really happened, she thought. When they landed, the cabin erupted into the familiar chaos of overhead bins and shuffling feet. Paramedics boarded swiftly, disappearing behind the curtain. Priscilla watched from her seat as the crew moved with efficient urgency, the aftermath of the emergency unfolding without her. She considered standing, saying something, asking if he would be all right. But something stopped her. By the time she stepped off the plane, the stranger was already gone. Life resumed its rhythm with unsettling speed. Madrid blurred into Frankfurt, Frankfurt into Zurich, Zurich into New York. Conference halls and sterile hotel rooms replaced the enclosed intimacy of the airplane cabin. Priscilla slipped back into her routine as if she'd never watched her blood flow into a dying man's veins at 35,000 feet. Except she couldn't forget it. The memory surfaced at odd moments, standing in line for coffee, brushing her teeth in a mirror-lit bathroom, lying awake at night, listening to the hum of traffic below her hotel window. She would feel again the slight dizziness, the warmth of her own pulse echoing through the tubing, the fragile stillness of the man's body beneath her hands, and she wondered if he'd survived. She wondered if he remembered anything at all. On her third night back in Brooklyn, she dreamed of the airplane. Not the emergency, just the endless aisle, stretching forward into darkness, seat after seat empty. When she woke, her heart was racing, her sheets tangled around her legs. She checked her phone. Nothing. No messages from the airline. No follow-ups. No confirmation that the man she'd helped was alive. For all she knew, the entire event could have dissolved into rumor and paperwork the moment the cabin doors opened. Priscilla told herself that was fine. She hadn't done it for recognition. Still, the absence left a hollow space she hadn't expected. A week later, the flowers arrived. It was late afternoon, the hour when sunlight slanted low through the narrow windows of her apartment, catching dust motes in the air. Priscilla had just dropped her bag by the door and kicked off her shoes when the buzzer sounded. She frowned. No one ever buzzed unannounced. "Hello?" she said into the intercom. "Delivery for Priscilla Morgan." She hesitated, then pressed the button. Minutes later, there was a knock. Firm, professional. When she opened the door, she found herself staring at an arrangement so extravagant it nearly blocked the hallway. White orchids spilled outward in layered arcs, threaded through with deep blue hydrangeas arranged in a spiral pattern that reminded her, inexplicably, of cloud formations viewed from above. The delivery man shifted his grip, clearly struggling under the weight. "Sign here," he said, holding out a tablet. "There must be a mistake," Priscilla said automatically. I don't... No mistake," he replied, already tapping his screen. "Premium order. Address matches." She signed, still half convinced the flowers belonged to someone else in the building. Once inside, the apartment felt suddenly smaller, overwhelmed by scent and color. The arrangement sat on her kitchen counter like something out of place, too refined for the chipped laminate and mismatched chairs. She searched for a card. It took her a moment to find it, nestled deep within the flowers. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a single, precise fold. Inside, written in neat, restrained handwriting, was a message that made her breath catch. "Thank you for the gift of life. Some debts are written in blood. No name." Just beneath the card lay a small velvet box. Priscilla hesitated before opening it. Inside rested a pin shaped like a tiny airplane, its wings studded with diamonds so small and flawless they caught the light without flashing. It was understated in a way that spoke of intentional restraint rather than cost, but there was no mistaking its value. Her pulse quickened. She sat down slowly, the box resting in her palm. So, he was alive. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Priscilla spent the rest of the evening pacing. She turned the pin over in her fingers, studying its weight, the smoothness of the metal, the deliberate simplicity of its design. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't sentimental in the obvious way. It felt careful. She called the florist first. They confirmed the order but refused to give her any details beyond what was already on the receipt. "Client confidentiality," the woman said politely. "What next, the airline?" She explained the situation, referencing the flight, the emergency, the blood donation. "I'm sorry," the representative said, sympathy threaded through her voice. "We can't share passenger information." By the time Priscilla hung up, the apartment felt too quiet. The pin sat on her coffee table, catching the fading light. She considered selling it. Jewelry stores would ask fewer questions than airlines. The money could go toward her father's care, toward rent, toward easing the ever-present tightness in her chest when she thought about the future. Gifts from strangers came with expectations, didn't they? And yet, when she imagined walking into a shop and handing it over, something twisted uncomfortably inside her. It wasn't guilt. It was curiosity. Who had he been, really? What kind of man sent a gift like this? Anonymous, precise, almost restrained? Why go to the trouble if he didn't want to be known? And why did the thought of never finding out feel like a loss? That night she placed the pin carefully on her dresser instead of tucking it away in a drawer. 3 weeks passed. Work consumed her days again. Meetings, product demos, endless conversations about innovation and outcomes, and metrics that blurred together until they lost their meaning. Life settled into its familiar pattern, the extraordinary moment receding slightly, as all things did when left unexamined. The flowers wilted, the scent faded, but the pin remained. Priscilla found herself glancing at it each morning as she dressed, its presence a quiet reminder of something unfinished. Sometimes she told herself she'd sell it. Other times she told herself she'd forget it existed. Neither happened. On a gray Tuesday morning, she boarded a flight to San Francisco for a conference she'd attended twice before. Same hotel, same schedule, same polite conversations that went nowhere. She stowed her carry-on and slid into her seat, exhaling as she buckled in. The cabin filled with the low murmur of boarding passengers, the familiar shuffle and scrape of travel. As she reached for her headphones, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. The feeling of being watched. Priscilla lifted her head slowly, eyes scanning the aisle, the rows behind her. Nothing obvious. She shook her head, dismissing it as nerves. Too much travel. Too little rest. Still, as she turned back toward the window, the sensation lingered, unsettling, insistent. Somewhere nearby, someone knew her name. And for the first time since the flight over the Atlantic, Priscilla felt certain of one thing. The stranger hadn't vanished at all. He had been waiting. Priscilla told herself she was imagining it. The cabin had that familiar pre-takeoff restlessness. Overhead bins thudding shut, flight attendants repeating safety instructions in practiced rhythms, passengers negotiating armrests and personal space. Nothing about it suggested danger or surprise. Nothing, she reasoned, justified the persistent sensation crawling up her spine. Still, she didn't relax. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes forward, the window reflecting her own faint outline back at her. The engines hummed. The plane rocked gently as ground crew finished their checks. Then a voice spoke her name, Priscilla Morgan. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It carried no trace of drama at all. That was what made it impossible to ignore. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and found herself looking into a pair of dark, steady eyes she recognized instantly. Despite having seen them only once before, half-lidded and unfocused, their owner hovering at the edge of consciousness. The man from the floor. Alive. Upright. Watching her with something like cautious relief. For a fraction of a second, neither of them spoke. He looked different. Not healthier exactly. There was still a faint pallor beneath his skin, a careful stillness in the way he held himself, but unmistakably present. His suit was impeccable, charcoal fabric falling cleanly across his shoulders. His hair was neatly styled, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than ease. "You're..." Priscilla began, then stopped. The obvious felt inadequate. He smiled, faint and restrained. "Alive," he said. "Because of you." The words landed harder than she expected. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was irritation. at herself, at the sudden warmth creeping up her neck, at the way the memory of that flight rushed back with startling clarity. "I wasn't sure," she said carefully. "After we landed, everything happened so fast." "It usually does," he replied, "when things matter." She studied him openly now, taking in the details she hadn't been able to see before. The faint shadow beneath his eyes, the composure that felt practiced rather than effortless, the way his attention never wavered from her face, as if the rest of the cabin had faded out entirely. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He considered the question longer than necessary. "Grateful," he said at last, "and still catching up to myself." A beat passed. "I wanted to thank you in person," he continued. "The flowers felt inadequate." Her lips curved despite herself. "They were hard to miss." "I hoped so." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, exactly, but charged. Priscilla became suddenly aware of the narrow space between their seats, of the fact that she had no clear exit if this conversation went somewhere she wasn't ready for. She gestured lightly toward the aisle. "Are you sitting here?" He glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, as if only now remembering it existed. "It appears so." Of course he was. She resisted the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it, the careful symmetry, the improbable coincidence. Instead, she nodded and turned back toward the window as he settled into the seat beside her. The plane doors closed with a dull thud. They spoke in fragments at first, small, careful exchanges that skirted the edges of what had happened without touching it directly. He asked about her work. She offered a concise explanation, the version she'd perfected for strangers who didn't need the details. Medical device consulting. Travel heavy. Demanding. "And you?" she asked. He paused. "Logistics," he said. "Among other things." It was vague enough to be true without being useful. She noted it, filed it away. "You recovered quickly," she said after a moment. "That kind of episode usually requires follow-up." "It did," he replied. "More than I expected." His tone carried a subtle weight, as though he were referencing something larger than the immediate aftermath. Priscilla considered pressing him, then decided against it. Boundaries mattered, especially now. When the plane leveled off and the cabin lights dimmed, he turned slightly toward her. "I never got your name," he said. "Priscilla." "I know." His gaze flicked briefly toward her, then away. "I asked the crew. After." She nodded, unsure how she felt about that. It wasn't inappropriate exactly, but it was personal in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm Bruno," he said. "Bruno Torres." The name didn't ring any bells. She waited for more. None came. "Well," she said lightly, "it's nice to officially meet you, Bruno. The pleasure is entirely mine." There it was again, that calm assurance, the quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but seemed accustomed to receiving it anyway. Priscilla felt herself stiffen slightly, her instincts urging caution. People like that, she'd learned, were often carried storms beneath the surface. They ate dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Priscilla tried to focus on her meal, but her awareness kept drifting back to him. The controlled movements, the occasional tightening of his jaw, the way his hand hovered briefly over his chest once before dropping back to his lap. "You shouldn't be flying," she said suddenly. He turned, surprised. "That obvious?" "You're guarding something," she replied. "Pain, maybe. Or memory." A corner of his mouth lifted. "Occupational hazard." She raised an eyebrow. "Of?" "Being human." This time she laughed softly. The sound seemed to relax him. Just a little. "I owe you more than thanks," he said after a pause. "I know that." "You don't owe me anything," she replied. I made a choice. That doesn't make the outcome less significant." He reached into his jacket and removed something small, placing it carefully on the armrest between them. The airplane pin. Priscilla stared at it, her breath catching despite herself. "I hoped you'd keep it," he said quietly. I didn't know what to do with it, she admitted. It felt complicated. It is, he agreed, but not in the way you're thinking. She looked at him then, really looked, and found something vulnerable beneath the composure. Not weakness, something more restrained. As if he were constantly holding parts of himself in check. Let me take you to dinner, he said. Not here. Somewhere with real food and no turbulence. Her instincts flared immediately. She didn't even know what he did for a living. She didn't know his history, his expectations, the unspoken assumptions that might come with accepting an invitation like that. I don't usually say yes to strangers, she replied. Most worthwhile things begin that way, he said gently. She studied him, weighing the risks she could see against the ones she couldn't. She thought about the pin on her dresser, about the flowers, about the way his voice had steadied when he'd said her name. She should have declined. Instead, she heard herself say, dinner. One time. His smile this time was unmistakable, quiet, genuine, edged with something like relief. I'll take that, he said. As the plane began its descent, Priscilla stared out the window, watching the lights of the city emerge below. Her reflection stared back at her, thoughtful, wary. She had the distinct, unsettling feeling that she'd just stepped onto unfamiliar ground. And she wasn't entirely sure whether she was walking toward danger or possibility. What would you have done in Priscilla's place? Accepted the dinner or walked away? Comment below and let us know. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. The restaurant didn't announce itself. There was no glowing sign, no velvet rope, no crowd spilling onto the sidewalk. From the street, it looked almost forgettable. Narrow frontage, frosted glass, a single door framed in dark wood. If Priscilla hadn't been watching closely, she might have walked past it without realizing this was where Bruno had led her. Inside, the air shifted. The noise of the city vanished as the door closed behind them, replaced by a hush that felt intentional rather than imposed. Soft light glowed from the hidden fixtures, reflecting off polished stone and warm wood. Conversations murmured at low volume, as though everyone present had agreed, silently, not to disturb one another. Priscilla paused just inside the entrance, instinctively straightening her jacket. She wasn't underdressed exactly. She'd chosen a simple navy dress and low heels, professional and understated, the kind of outfit that blended into conference dinners and business meetings. Still, as she took in the room, the tailored suits, the effortless elegance, the quiet confidence of the patrons, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. You don't belong here, a voice whispered. She ignored it. Bruno didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. A host approached immediately, greeting him with a nod that carried recognition without familiarity. And no name was exchanged. No reservation was confirmed aloud. They were simply led past the main dining area into a smaller, more secluded space toward the back. As they walked, Priscilla noticed the subtle shift in attention. Heads turned, not obviously, not rudely, but enough to register. Conversations paused, then resumed. Bruno acknowledged no one, yet the room seemed to orient itself around him all the same. He owned it without trying. The realization unsettled her more than she expected. Their table sat near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, lights scattered below like constellations pulled too close to Earth. When Bruno pulled out her chair, Priscilla hesitated for half a second before sitting, aware of how the gesture landed, courteous, old-fashioned, deliberate. "Thank you," she said. Of course." The waiter appeared almost immediately, offering menus they barely glanced at before Bruno spoke quietly, confidently, in a way that suggested trust rather than instruction. The waiter nodded once and disappeared. "You come here often?" Priscilla asked. "Not often," Bruno replied. "But when I do, it's because I want to think." She considered that. "Seems expensive for thinking." He smiled faintly. "Clarity has a cost." The comment wasn't arrogant. If anything, it sounded practical. They sat in silence for a moment, the space between them filled with the ambient sounds of cutlery and soft music. Priscilla found herself studying him again, the way his jacket fit perfectly without looking tailored to impress, the stillness of his posture, the subtle awareness that never seemed to switch off. "So," she said finally. "Logistics." His eyebrow lifted. "Still curious?" "Still cautious." "Fair," he said. "I work in systems, moving things where they need to go, anticipating failure before it happens." "Supply chains?" she guessed. "Among other things?" She smiled, accepting the partial answer for what it was. People revealed themselves in layers. Pushing too soon only made them retreat. The food arrived in careful courses, each plate placed with quiet ceremony. The flavors were precise, unexpected. Priscilla ate slowly, aware of how long it had been since she'd sat at a table like this, without a laptop or agenda between her and the person across from her. "This is incredible," she admitted. Bruno watched her for a moment, something like satisfaction flickering across his face. Not pride exactly, more like approval. "Pleasure has its place," he said, "but I value function more." She tilted her head. "Even here?" "Especially here. Everything in this room exists for a reason. Nothing is wasted." It sounded like a philosophy rather than an observation. "And you?" he asked. "Why medical devices?" Priscilla hesitated. It wasn't a question she usually answered honestly. The polished version, "I like helping hospitals improve outcomes," was easier, safer. But something about the way he asked, the absence of judgment in his tone, made evasion feel unnecessary. "My father," she said quietly. Bruno didn't interrupt. "He's had heart problems for years," she continued. "Watching the machines, the monitors, seeing how much of survival depends on access and timing, it changed how I saw things. I wanted to be on the side that made care possible, even indirectly." She took a sip of water, steadying herself. "It also meant travel. A lot of it. Promotions come faster when you say yes to everything." "And you did," he said. "Yes." She smiled thinly. "Until yes became automatic." They fell into a thoughtful silence. "I imagine it takes a toll," he said finally. "On everything," she replied. "Relationships, health, any sense of home. Yet you continue." "I don't know how to stop." The admission surprised her. She rarely said things like that out loud. Bruno leaned back slightly, studying her with renewed intensity. "Survival often disguises itself as ambition," he said, "especially in people who've learned not to expect safety." Her breath caught. "That sounds specific," she said carefully. "It is." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. Instead, she found herself wondering what it had cost him to become the man sitting across from her now. What sacrifices had been folded neatly into the calm assurance he wore so easily. The conversation shifted, drifting through safer territory, cities they'd visited, food they missed, the strange dislocation of living out of suitcases. Yet beneath it all ran an undercurrent of recognition, a quiet understanding that neither of them articulated. When dessert arrived, something delicate and artfully restrained, Priscilla laughed softly. "I think this is the first meal I've had in months where no one talked about deliverables." "Then it was worth it," Bruno said. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not just the composed exterior, but the faint tension beneath it, of the way his fingers flexed subtly against the table as if resisting a habit of control. "You're very calm," she said. "Am I?" "Yes," she said. "Even when things go wrong?" "Appearances," he replied. "I don't like panic. It clouds judgment." "And yet," she said gently, "you collapsed on a plane." Something shifted. The air between them tightened, not unpleasantly, but with the weight of a truth approaching the surface. Bruno held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Fair." He took a slow breath. "I don't take unnecessary risks. That day was miscalculated." "Because of pressure?" she asked. because of responsibility, he said. There's a difference. She sensed the boundary there, the line he wouldn't cross. Not yet. As the meal drew to a close, the city lights outside seemed brighter, closer, where Priscilla felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in her chest. Not attraction alone, but connection. The kind that formed quietly, without spectacle. When the waiter returned with the bill, Bruno handled it with the same understated efficiency he'd shown all evening. No glances exchanged, no hesitation. As they stood to leave, Priscilla felt a flicker of reluctance. The night had unfolded gently, without demands or expectations. She hadn't realized how much she needed that until it was nearly over. Outside, the air was cool, the city alive around them. They paused on the sidewalk, neither quite ready to part ways. Bruno turned to her then, his expression unreadable. There's something I've wanted to ask you, he said. She braced herself. All right. On the plane, he continued, voice low, steady. When they asked for your blood type, you didn't hesitate. She shook her head. I did. Briefly, he corrected. Then you stood up. Yes. Why? He asked. You didn't know me. You had no obligation. Priscilla considered the question carefully. She could give him a dozen answers. Logic, ethics, training, responsibility. Instead, she said the truth. Because you needed help, she replied, and I could provide it. The simplicity of the answer seemed to strike him harder than anything else she'd said all evening. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled, slow and unguarded, as though something inside him had shifted, quietly, irrevocably. I see, he said softly. And for the first time since they'd met, Bruno Torres looked genuinely shaken. The first gift arrived 3 days after dinner. Priscilla came home late, go to her apartment dim except for the strip of light spilling from the kitchen window. She dropped her bag by the door, toes aching from a day spent pacing conference floors, when she noticed the package waiting just inside the threshold. It was small, tasteful, wrapped in thick paper the color of old parchment. Her chest tightened. For a moment she simply stood there, keys still in her hand, listening to the muted sounds of the city drifting up from the street below. Traffic, voices, life continuing, indifferent to the quiet shift taking place inside her. She hadn't given Bruno her address. Had she? She set her bag down slowly and picked up the package. No return label. Just her name, written neatly, unmistakably intentional. Inside she found a book, an art monograph, rare, judging by the weight of it, the careful binding. Yeah, inside the cover was a single note, tucked so neatly it almost felt like an afterthought. You mentioned you liked pieces that solved problems quietly. No signature. She sat on the edge of her couch, the book resting on her knees, and let out a slow breath. It wasn't extravagant. Not in the way the flowers had been. It was thoughtful, specific. The kind of gift that suggested attention rather than excess. That somehow unsettled her more. The second gift arrived a week later. A silk scarf, folded precisely, its colors rich and unexpected. Deep indigo threaded with warm gold. She held it up to the light, watching the fabric catch and release the glow. She didn't need a mirror to know it would suit her. You're kidding me, her friend Talia said over the phone later that night. That's not a gift. That's a statement. Priscilla leaned against the kitchen counter, the scarf draped over her wrist. It's just a scarf. No, Talia said flatly. It's a billionaire scarf. Priscilla winced. You don't know that, Talia snorted. Please, nobody sends silk like that without an agenda. Priscilla didn't argue. She didn't know how to. Because the gifts weren't random. They arrived with a precision that mirrored Bruno himself. Never too much, never careless. Always something that felt considered. And always, she noticed, arriving shortly after moments when she'd mentioned something in passing. A preference, an interest, a frustration. It was flattering. and deeply disorienting. Invitations followed. At first they were easy to decline. A gallery opening she was too tired to attend. A lecture she'd already heard once before. Bruno accepted her refusals with effortless grace, never pressing, never questioning. Then came the events she couldn't dismiss so easily. A technology summit she was already planning to attend. Only now she was offered access to rooms she'd never set foot in before. Private dinners, closed-door panels, conversations where names were spoken softly but carried immense weight. She went once, then twice. Each time she felt the shift. In public, Bruno was different. Not unkind, not cold, just expanded. People leaned toward him when he spoke. Conversations paused when he entered a room. Decisions seemed to orbit him without his having to touch them. And beside him, Priscilla felt hyper-visible. Not because he drew attention to her, he didn't, but because others did. Curious glances, measured smiles, questions framed too politely to be innocent. Who is she? Why her? At one event, a woman she barely knew leaned close and whispered, "You must be very special." The words were meant as a compliment. They landed like a warning. In private, Bruno remained the man she'd shared dinner with. The one who listened more than he spoke, who noticed details others missed, who asked questions that weren't designed to impress. He never rushed her, never claimed her time, never defined what they were doing together. And yet, the space he occupied in her life grew steadily larger. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Priscilla found herself standing in her bedroom, holding the diamond airplane pin in one hand and the silk scarf in the other. She stared at her reflection. Is this how it starts? She wondered. She'd seen this story before. Powerful men collecting interesting people like artifacts, stories to be told, moments to be savored, then set aside when novelty faded. She had promised herself she would never be that. The warnings came quietly at first. A colleague raised an eyebrow during lunch. "You've been busy lately." An old mentor asked gently whether she was comfortable with the attention. Talia was less subtle. "You're not an experienced Pris," she said bluntly over drinks one night. "You're a person. Don't let him forget that." "I don't think he would," Priscilla replied, though the words lacked the certainty she wanted them to carry. "Men like that don't forget," Talia said. "They just redefine." The comment lingered long after they parted ways. The offer arrived on a Tuesday morning, so Priscilla was halfway through her coffee when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost let it go to voicemail, then answered out of habit. "Priscilla Morgan?" a woman asked. "Yes." "This is Elena Cruz, calling from Torres Global." Priscilla's hand tightened around her mug. "We've been following your work for some time," Elena continued smoothly. "Mr. Torres has recommended you for a consulting role within a new division we're launching." Priscilla closed her eyes. "Consulting," she repeated carefully. "Yes, medical technology, systems integration. We believe your background would be invaluable." There was a pause. Of course, the compensation reflects the scope of the role. The number that followed made her breath catch. Triple her current salary. Travel accommodations fully covered. Yeah, flexibility she hadn't known to ask for. Her mind raced ahead, uninvited. Her father's medical bills. The weight she carried every month. The future she'd been postponing indefinitely. "Take your time," Elena said. "We'll send over the details." When the call ended, Priscilla sat very still. She didn't call Bruno right away. She read the offer twice, then a third time. Every line was precise, deliberate. No ambiguity, no pressure. And yet the implications pressed in on her from all sides. If she accepted, people would talk. They already were. They would assume things about her competence, her motivations, her relationship with Bruno. They would wonder what she'd given in exchange. That night, she met Talia for dinner and told her everything. Talia listened without interrupting, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. "Do you want the job?" she asked when Priscilla finished. Yes, Priscilla said immediately, then hesitated. I think so. Do you trust him? Priscilla considered that. I trust that he believes in what he's building. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Silence stretched between them. You're afraid of being collected, Talia said softly. Priscilla swallowed. Yes. And you're afraid of saying no to something that could change your life. Yes. Talia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then whatever you choose it with your eyes open. Priscilla didn't sleep that night. She thought about her father, about the quiet dignity with which he endured each new limitation, about the way he'd once told her, don't make yourself smaller just to feel safe. So she thought about Bruno, about the way he'd looked when she'd answered his question honestly, about the crack in his composure, brief but real. In the morning, she called Elena back. I'll accept, she said. The words felt both empowering and precarious. When the call ended, Priscilla sat at her kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the floor, and let the weight of her decision settle. She had chosen opportunity. She had chosen risk. And as unease curled softly in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything, absolutely everything, was about to change. The headquarters didn't feel like a building so much as a statement. Glass and steel rose from the street with disciplined symmetry, its clean lines reflecting the city back at itself. From the outside, it was impressive. From the inside, it was imposing in a quieter, or more deliberate way, designed to remind you, subtly but constantly, that power lived here. Priscilla felt it the moment she stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby was expansive, polished to a mirror sheen, with ceilings high enough to swallow sound. Screens along the walls displayed live data feeds, logistics routes, shipment volumes, system performance metrics updating in real time. Everything moved. Everything measured itself. A woman in a tailored suit greeted her by name before Priscilla could speak. This way, Ms. Morgan. She followed, heels clicking softly against the floor, acutely aware of every glance that slid in her direction. Not hostile, not welcoming either. Curious, assessing. Who is she? Why her? The questions hung unspoken in the air. The boardroom sat at the heart of the building, all glass walls and seamless technology. Executives filtered in one by one, conversations pausing just long enough to register Priscilla's presence before resuming at a lower volume. Bruno entered last. The shift was immediate. Postures straightened, voices stilled. The room oriented itself toward him as naturally as iron toward a magnet. He acknowledged the group with a brief nod, his expression neutral, composed. Let's begin, he said. Priscilla took her seat, the chair too comfortable to be accidental. She listened as discussions unfolded, strategic expansions, risk assessments, contingency planning. The language was sharp, efficient, stripped of sentiment. She recognized it instantly. This was survival at scale. Every decision carried weight. Every failure echoed outward. When she spoke, it was carefully, precisely. How she chose her moments, grounding her contributions in data, in outcomes, in systems she understood intimately. Heads turned, not dismissively, but with interest. Still, she felt the scrutiny. Not just as a newcomer, as a woman, as a black woman, as someone whose proximity to Bruno invited assumptions no one bothered to hide particularly well. Afterward, in the hallway, an executive smiled too brightly and said, "Impressive resume." It sounded like a challenge. The days blurred into a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. Meetings stacked on meetings, late nights reviewing models, stress-testing systems, refining processes designed to prevent failure in places where failure meant lives lost. Priscilla threw herself into the work, grateful for the clarity it offered. Here, competence mattered. Mostly, she noticed the moments that didn't fit, the pauses before her ideas were acknowledged, until someone else repeated them, the subtle recalibrations when she pushed back, the careful politeness that edged into condescension if she wasn't vigilant. Bruno never intervened publicly. At first, she resented that. Then she understood. He didn't need to protect her. He needed the room to learn she didn't require it. Late nights became common. The building quieted after 10, the hum of activity settling into something more intimate. Screens glowed softly. City lights blinked far below. It was during one of those nights, both of them standing by the windows, files scattered across the conference table, that Priscilla noticed Bruno's hand tighten briefly against the glass. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, too quickly. "You sure?" she pressed. A pause. Then, with a faint exhale, "Not entirely." She waited. "I have a condition," he said at last. "A rare blood disorder. It complicates things." Her chest tightened. "The flight wasn't my first episode," he admitted. "Just the most public." She turned toward him fully now. "You shouldn't have been flying." "I needed to," he replied. "There are times when isolation is more dangerous than risk." She thought of the plane, of the doctor's tight expression, of the silence after the blood type announcement. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Most of my life." "And you still run a global operation?" "Because stopping wouldn't make it go away." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than the revelation itself. He glanced at her then, something unguarded crossing his face. "You didn't hesitate," he said quietly. "That day." She met his gaze. "I did." "Not in the way that matters." The space between them shifted, charged with things neither of them named. They worked later than planned. At some point, coffee went untouched. Files lay forgotten. Conversation drifted, away from metrics and margins, toward quieter truths. "My father's sick," Priscilla said suddenly. Bruno didn't look surprised. "You carry it with you," he said. "Like a weight you've learned not to set down." She smiled faintly. "That obvious?" "To someone who recognizes it." She hesitated, then added, "I'm afraid of losing him. And I'm afraid of becoming someone who only knows how to function under pressure." Bruno's voice softened. "Pressure shapes us," he said. "But it shouldn't define us." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the cost of the world he commanded etched in small, careful ways. Without quite deciding to, she stepped closer. So did he. The city stretched beneath them, vast and indifferent. When he kissed her, it was careful, almost tentative, as if he were offering the moment rather than taking it. His hand rested lightly at her waist, warm, steady. For a breath, she didn't move. Then she kissed him back. The connection wasn't urgent. It was deliberate. Two people acknowledging something they'd been circling for weeks. When they parted, Priscilla let out a soft laugh, half disbelief, half recognition. This complicates everything. The gala was not meant to feel dangerous. Everything about it suggested celebration. Soft, orchestral music drifting through the ballroom, crystal glasses catching light, a sea of tailored suits and evening gowns moving in graceful currents. The venue overlooked the harbor, so floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a carefully curated backdrop. Priscilla stood beside Bruno, near the edge of the room, her hand resting lightly at his elbow. It was the first time they'd arrived together without ambiguity. And everyone noticed. She felt it in the way conversations faltered, then resumed at a lower volume. In the glances that lingered a second too long. In the subtle recalibration of smiles when people realized she wasn't an assistant, or a consultant, or someone who could be politely dismissed. She was with him. Bruno, for his part, seemed entirely at ease. He greeted colleagues with composed nods, exchanged quiet words with donors and executives, his presence anchoring the room without demanding it. Priscilla admired that about him. She also knew, now more than ever, that ease came from years of control. "You all right?" Bruno murmured, noticing the tension creeping into her shoulders. Yes, she said automatically. Then more honestly, I think so. Stay close, he said. Not because you need it, because I'd like you to. The warmth in his tone steadied her. They moved deeper into the crowd. That was when she felt it. The shift. It was subtle at first, an undercurrent of attention redirecting itself, a ripple moving against the flow of the room. Priscilla glanced up instinctively and saw him watching them from across the ballroom. He stood near the bar, tall and impeccably dressed, his suit cut sharply, his posture radiating the same wealth and authority as Bruno's, without any of the restraint. His gaze lingered on Priscilla, appraising rather than curious. Uncomfortable. Who's that? She asked quietly, where Bruno's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Chase Caldwell. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Bruno said it, measured, precise, told her enough. Rival? She asked. Competitor, Bruno corrected, and opportunist. As if summoned by the acknowledgement, Chase crossed the room toward them, a glass of champagne in hand, smile already in place. Bruno Torres, he said warmly, you're difficult to corner these days. Efficiency has its costs, Bruno replied coolly. Chase's attention shifted to Priscilla. His eyes lingered just long enough to feel intentional. And you must be, he began. Priscilla Morgan, she said, extending her hand before he could finish the sentence for her. His grip was firm, assessing. Ah, he said, something flickering behind his smile. Of course. The word landed with an emphasis she didn't like. Enjoying the evening? Chase continued, glancing between them. It's been informative, Priscilla said. Chase chuckled softly. That's one word for it. He turned back to Bruno. Congratulations are in order. The market responded enthusiastically. Bruno's expression didn't change. Innovation tends to do that. Especially when it comes with such a compelling narrative, Chase replied smoothly. Priscilla felt the first prickle of unease. Narrative? She asked. Chase raised his glass slightly. The mid-air emergency. The heroic intervention. Investors love a story with heart. The words echoed too closely to something she'd been avoiding. Bruno's voice sharpened. This isn't the time. Oh, I think it is, Chase said lightly. Transparency is all the rage. He turned fully toward Priscilla now, his smile polite, his eyes sharp. Oh, you must be proud, he said, being at the center of Torres Global's most successful quarter. Her pulse quickened. I'm not sure what you mean. Chase's brows lifted in mock surprise. Really? I assumed you knew. Bruno stepped forward. That's enough. But Chase was already continuing. The emergency transfusion system, he said, gesturing vaguely. The one your experience helped validate. Stock jumped 8% the following morning. The room seemed to tilt. Priscilla's breath caught, the sounds around her fading into a dull roar. Validate? She repeated. Chase's smile widened just slightly. Real-world proof of concept is invaluable, especially when it's dramatic enough to make headlines. She turned slowly to Bruno. His silence was louder than any answer. You used that flight, she said quietly. I gave my blood. Bruno opened his mouth, then closed it again. It wasn't like that, he said finally. The technology existed long before, but you knew, she interrupted. Her voice remained steady, though something inside her fractured. You knew what it meant. I didn't plan the emergency, he said. I didn't orchestrate. You allowed it to become leverage, she said. You let it be framed as success. Chase watched the exchange with undisguised interest. Oh, don't look so betrayed, he said. This is business. You, of all people, should understand that. Priscilla's hands curled at her sides. I'm not a case study, she said. Chase tilted his head. Aren't you? She felt the weight of the room pressing in, the subtle shift of attention, the quiet realization spreading as fragments of the conversation reached nearby ears. She was part of the product. She didn't even know. Humiliation burned beneath her composure. Bruno reached for her arm. "Priscilla." She stepped back. "No," she said softly. "Don't." The word carried finality. She glanced around the room one last time, at the polished faces, the careful distance, the unspoken judgments crystallizing into certainty. Then she turned and walked away. The music swelled behind her as she crossed the ballroom alone, heels striking marble with a rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. She didn't look back. The headlines broke before dawn. Priscilla woke to her phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the dark room in sharp bursts. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, the memory of the gala rushing back in fragments. The music, the lights, is the way she'd walked out without looking back. The first notification was from an unfamiliar number. "Are you okay?" Then another. "You should see this." Then dozens more. She sat up, heart pounding, and opened the news app she avoided on instinct. The story stared back at her. Billionaire CEO's mystery companion. Exposed from mid-air hero to corporate asset. Blood, billions, and a woman in the middle. Her name followed soon after. Not buried, not softened. Priscilla Morgan. Her chest tightened as she scrolled. Photos, some recent, some disturbingly intimate, filled the screen. Bruno leaning toward her at the gala. Bruno's hand at her back as they entered a private dinner. A grainy image of them standing close by the windows late one night at headquarters, the angle suggestive enough to invite speculation. The narrative assembled itself with brutal efficiency. She wasn't a consultant. She wasn't a professional. She was a strategy. A pretty story. A convenient one. Priscilla dropped the phone onto the bed and pressed her palms to her eyes, breathing hard. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in with the weight of strangers' conclusions. When she picked the phone back up, the comments were worse. "Funny how it's always a woman like that. Guess blood donations come with perks. Another gold digger who got lucky. He saved her career. She saved his life. Fair trade." The language sharpened as she scrolled. Speculation about her intelligence, her integrity, her body, her worth. And beneath it all, the undercurrent she knew too well. Racism dressed up as curiosity, misogyny disguised as concern. But she stopped reading when her hands began to shake. By noon, the story had metastasized. Her inbox filled with requests, interviews, comments, clarifications. Some polite, others thinly veiled demands. Her company's legal department scheduled an emergency call she hadn't asked for. "Conflict of interest concerns," her supervisor said carefully. "Perception matters." Priscilla stared at the wall as he spoke, the words washing over her without landing. Perception. As if she were a brand that had misfired, rather than a person whose life had been upended overnight. "We're not terminating your contract," he added quickly. "But we need distance. For now. Distance." The word echoed hollowly. After the call ended, Priscilla sat at her kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside her. How she tried to make sense of how quickly everything had shifted, how a single narrative, once released, could rewrite months of work, years of credibility. She thought of her father back in Baltimore, likely seeing the headlines, worrying silently. She thought of her colleagues, parsing the story through their own assumptions. She thought of the way the room had gone quiet at the gala, the moment the truth had twisted into something else entirely. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Bruno. She stared at his name for a long moment before answering. "Priscilla," he said, voice tight. "I'm so sorry." She closed her eyes. "It's everywhere." "I know. We're issuing a statement. Legal is handling—" "I don't want a statement," she said. "I want my life back." Silence stretched between them. "I never intended for this to touch you like this," he said quietly. "And yet it did," she replied. Not accusatory. Just factual. "I should have protected you," he said. The words landed heavily. You can't protect me from what people choose to believe, she said. You can only choose whether you give them reasons. Another pause. I'm trying to contain it, he said. To redirect the narrative. She laughed softly, a brittle sound. You think this is about narrative? What is it about then? He asked. She considered that. It's about power, she said. And who gets to define truth? The days that followed blurred together. Priscilla stopped leaving the apartment except when necessary. She ignored the doorman's sympathetic glances, the whispers she imagined trailing her down the hall. She turned off notifications. Then turned off her phone entirely for hours at a time. But the noise found her anyway. Screenshots sent by well-meaning friends, headlines evolving, mutating, opinion pieces questioning her qualifications, her motives, her right to occupy the spaces she'd fought to earn. One article dissected her resume line by line, framing each achievement as suspicious in hindsight. Was she always destined for this? The author wondered aloud, as if destiny were a shortcut rather than a struggle. Bruno tried to help. He sent messages she didn't answer, left voicemails she listened to but didn't return. He assured her legal teams were working, that the board stood behind him, that none of this changed what he knew to be true. But truth felt fragile now, thin as glass, easily shattered by repetition. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, Priscilla met Talia at a quiet bar far from the city's usual circuits. Talia took one look at her and swore softly. They did this to you. Priscilla nodded, exhaustion seeping into her bones. I don't recognize myself anymore. Talia reached across the table, gripping her hand. You're still you. They just don't get to decide that. But they already have, Priscilla said. At least publicly. Public opinion isn't truth, Talia said fiercely. It feels powerful enough to be, Priscilla replied. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling. Do you love him? Talia asked gently. Priscilla hesitated. Yes, she said. The word surprised her with its certainty. But I don't know if love survives this. Talia nodded. Then you need to decide what you're willing to lose. That night, Priscilla returned home to a building that felt unfamiliar. She moved through her apartment slowly, touching familiar objects as if to anchor herself. The worn arm of the couch, the edge of the kitchen counter, the airplane pin still resting on her dresser. She picked it up, turning it between her fingers. Once it had symbolized gratitude, connection, fate. Now it felt heavier. A reminder of how easily intention could be repurposed into narrative, how quickly sacrifice could be reframed as strategy. She set it down and sank onto the edge of the bed, head in her hands. She didn't hear the elevator at first, only the knock, firm, deliberate. Priscilla froze. Another knock followed, polite, unyielding. Her heart hammered as she stood, every instinct warning her that whatever waited on the other side of the door would change things again, so she took a breath and moved toward the sound. The woman at the door did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Priscilla opened the door to find her standing perfectly upright in the hallway, hands folded at her waist, posture composed in a way that suggested discipline rather than ease. Her hair was streaked with silver and pulled back neatly, her coat tailored with understated elegance. Two younger women stood slightly behind her, silent, observant. Priscilla Morgan, the woman said, her tone courteous and precise. May we come in? It was not a question. Priscilla hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. The woman entered without looking around, as though she already knew exactly what she would find. The two younger women followed, positioning themselves near the wall, unobtrusive, yet unmistakably present. I am Isabella Torres, the woman said once they were inside. Bruno's mother. The words landed with a dull finality. Priscilla nodded. I know who you are. I imagine you do, Isabella replied. These are unfortunate circumstances under which to meet. She removed her gloves slowly, deliberately, and handed them to one of the women behind her. The gesture felt ceremonial, as though she were preparing for something formal, rather than personal. "Please," Priscilla said, gesturing toward the couch. "Have a seat." Isabella remained standing. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "I prefer clarity." Priscilla straightened, folding her arms loosely across her chest. Her heart raced, but she refused to let it show. "Then please be clear," she said. Isabella inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging a worthy opponent. "My son's life is complicated," she began. "Not because of wealth, as people like to assume, but because of responsibility. Thousands of employees, entire systems that rely on his decisions, a family legacy built on survival rather than sentiment." Priscilla listened without interrupting. "Recent events," Isabella continued, "have created unnecessary instability." "You mean the scandal," Priscilla said evenly. Isabella's lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. "I mean the exposure." The distinction stung. "My son has always understood that his personal choices ripple outward," Isabella said. "Unfortunately, not everyone in his orbit understands that reality." Priscilla felt heat rise beneath her calm. "Are you suggesting I caused this?" "I am suggesting," Isabella replied smoothly, "is that your presence has amplified it." The words were delivered without malice. That made them sharper. Priscilla took a breath. "With respect, your son is an adult. He makes his own choices." Isabella studied her for a long moment, eyes assessing, weighing. "Independence is a luxury," she said finally, "one that diminishes as power increases." She stepped closer, her voice lowering just enough to feel intimate. "You come from a different world, Miss Morgan. One where mistakes are contained, where consequences fall inward." Priscilla met her gaze. "And you believe your world is superior?" "I believe it is less forgiving," Isabella said, "which is why alignment matters." There it was. The quiet dismissal wrapped in politeness. "You've been investigated," Isabella continued calmly. "Thoroughly. Your education, your family, your career trajectory. Respectable. Hard-won." Priscilla's stomach tightened. "You had no right." "We investigate anyone who comes close to our family," Isabella interrupted, still courteous. "It is not personal." "It feels personal," Priscilla said. Isabella tilted her head. "You should take that as a compliment." The audacity of it stole Priscilla's breath for a moment. "My son is vulnerable," Isabella went on. "Medically, strategically, emotionally. The last is the most dangerous." Priscilla's voice remained steady. "You think I'm a threat?" "I think you are a liability," Isabella said simply. "Not because you lack character, but because you possess it." The words echoed painfully. "You challenge him," Isabella continued. "You distract him. You remind him of things he cannot afford to indulge." Priscilla felt something crack, not loudly but deeply. "And what?" she asked quietly. "Are you asking of me?" Isabella held her gaze. "You will remove yourself from his life," she said. "Publicly and privately. You will resign from your position. You will allow this phase to conclude before it damages him further." Silence pressed in. "And if I don't?" Priscilla asked. Isabella's expression did not change. "Then I will ensure the narrative becomes less kind." Priscilla understood the implication immediately. Not threats. Consequences. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. "You're asking me to disappear," Priscilla said. "I am asking you to be wise," Isabella replied. Priscilla closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "You speak of legacy," she said. "Of responsibility. But you've mistaken obedience for dignity." Isabella's eyes sharpened. "Careful." "No," Priscilla said softly. "I won't be." She straightened, every ounce of fatigue and fear settling into resolve. "I will not be remembered as a mistake your son had to correct," she said, "or a story your family buried." Isabella regarded her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded. "You are proud," she said. "That is admirable." "It's survival," Priscilla replied. Isabella stepped back, reclaiming her gloves. "Then you understand," she said, "why this must end." She turned toward the door, the two women falling into step behind her. At the threshold, Isabella paused. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "my son will suffer." The door closed softly behind her. Priscilla didn't cry. Not then. So she stood in the center of her apartment for a long time, listening to the echo of Isabella's words, feeling the weight of them settle into her bones. She knew what she had to do. By morning, she had drafted her resignation. It was brief, professional, final. She sent it before she could change her mind. She blocked Bruno's number. That hurt more than she expected. She packed quietly, efficiently. Clothes folded with care, objects chosen deliberately. She left the things that tied her to this place. Framed certificates, event invitations, the silk scarf. The airplane pin remained on the dresser. For a moment she considered taking it with her. Then she left it where it was. Priscilla booked a flight under a different name, using miles she'd forgotten she had. No social media announcements, no goodbyes beyond a single text to Talia. I need to disappear for a while. I'll explain when I can." At dawn, she stepped into a cab with one suitcase and no destination she could name aloud. As the city receded behind her, Priscilla Morgan vanished from the world that had decided who she was. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Priscilla did not see the headline at first. She was 3 days into anonymity, tucked into a borrowed life that asked nothing of her beyond waking up and breathing. The coastal town was small, deliberate in its quiet. No one hurried. No one stared. The ocean existed without commentary, vast and indifferent. She had turned her phone off when she arrived. That was the point. On the 4th morning, she turned it back on. The notifications flooded in immediately. Missed calls, unread messages, such voicemails stacked like unanswered questions. She ignored most of them, scrolling until a familiar name froze her in place. Talia, 12 missed calls. Her stomach tightened. She opened the most recent message. "Pris, please call me. It's Bruno." Priscilla's thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't want to know. Knowing meant returning to a world she had deliberately erased herself from. It meant reopening wounds she had only just begun to close. It meant choosing between survival and truth all over again. The phone buzzed again in her hand. She answered. "Pris," Talia said, breathless. "Thank God. Where are you?" "What happened?" Priscilla asked quietly. There was a pause. Too long. "He collapsed," Talia said. "Publicly. On stage." The world seemed to tilt. "When?" Priscilla whispered. "Last night, during the launch in Chicago. He barely finished his opening remarks before he went down." Priscilla closed her eyes, images flashing through her mind. The glass-walled boardroom, the faint tightening of Bruno's hand against the window, the careful way he'd learned to mask pain. "Is he alive?" she asked. "Yes," Talia said quickly. "But it's bad. They rushed him to St. Vincent's. ICU." The ocean roared somewhere beyond the thin walls of the room. Priscilla felt suddenly very far away from everything that mattered. "They're saying it's related to his blood disorder," Talia continued. "And Pris, it's everywhere." Priscilla didn't need clarification. Public collapse. Powerful man. Cameras. "I can't," Priscilla said automatically. "I'm not supposed to be—" "I know," Talia said gently. "I know what you promised. But I thought you should know." Priscilla sat on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to her ear, heart pounding. After they hung up, she remained there for a long time, staring at nothing. She had left to protect herself. She had disappeared to preserve her dignity. But some instincts did not obey distance or logic. They rose when they were needed. The flight back felt longer than the one she'd taken to leave. Priscilla barely remembered booking it. Only the mechanical motions, packing, checking out, moving through the airport like a ghost. She kept her head down, a hood pulled low, her name absent from every screen. By the time she landed, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. St. Vincent's was chaos. Satellite trucks lined the street outside the hospital, cables snaking across the pavement. Security guards stood at every entrance, redirecting foot traffic, murmuring rehearsed statements about privacy and patience. Priscilla stopped short when she saw the crowd. She hadn't expected this. People held phones aloft, whispering, speculating. Reporters spoke urgently into cameras, their words blending into a steady hum of narrative being constructed in real time. Billionaire CEO hospitalized after sudden collapse. Questions raised about ongoing health concerns. Company stock fluctuates amid uncertainty. Priscilla pulled her jacket tighter around herself and moved forward. At the entrance, a guard stepped into her path. "Visiting hours are suspended," he said. "I'm not visiting," she replied. "I need to see him." The guard glanced at his list. "Name?" She hesitated. "Priscilla Morgan." Recognition flickered briefly across his face before hardening into something else. "I'm sorry," he said. "You can't go in." Her pulse quickened. "I need to speak with his doctors." "Ma'am?" "I was involved in his last medical emergency," she said. "I donated blood." That gave him pause. Another guard approached, murmured something quietly. The first guard nodded, then shook his head. "You still can't enter," he said. "Orders from the family." "Of course." Priscilla stepped back, frustration flaring. Inside, somewhere beyond the glass and security barriers, Bruno lay unconscious, his body once again betraying him in front of the world. And she stood on the outside, exactly where Isabella Torres had intended. She paced the lobby, mind racing. She spotted familiar faces. Executives, assistants, legal representatives. None met her eyes. Some pretended not to see her at all. She found a quiet corner and waited. A minute stretched into an hour. Then another. A doctor emerged at last, speaking urgently with a group of suited men. Priscilla watched his expression closely. The tightness around his mouth, the way his shoulders sagged slightly as he spoke. Something was wrong. She stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to speak with you." The doctor turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Yes?" "I'm Priscilla Morgan," she said. "I was the donor during his mid-flight emergency." The doctor's brows knit together. "You're the AB negative donor." "Yes." He glanced back toward the ICU doors, then lowered his voice. "We've been trying to stabilize him," he said, "but his body isn't responding as we'd hoped." Her chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that conventional transfusions aren't working." The words landed heavily. Priscilla swallowed. "What do you need?" Before he could answer, a woman approached briskly. Isabella's assistant, Priscilla recognized. Her gaze was sharp, disapproving. "There's been a mistake," the woman said. "This area is restricted." The doctor hesitated. Then he exhaled, a decision settling into place. "We need AB negative," he said quietly. "Now." The words echoed in Priscilla's ears, heavy with inevitability. She didn't hesitate. The room was colder than Priscilla expected. Hospitals always were, but this cold felt deliberate, as if the air itself were meant to keep emotions contained. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting everything in a sterile glow. Machines beeped in steady, indifferent rhythms. Bruno lay motionless in the bed, but for a moment Priscilla couldn't move. She stood just inside the doorway, hands clenched at her sides, taking in the sight of him. Paler than she'd ever seen him, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, wires tracing quiet paths across his skin. The man who had owned every room he entered now looked impossibly fragile, reduced to numbers on a monitor. She had walked away to protect herself. Now she was here because she couldn't do anything else. "Ms. Morgan." The doctor's voice cut gently through her thoughts. "If you're willing, we need to act quickly." Priscilla nodded. "What do you need from me?" "A direct transfusion," he said. "Your blood worked before. His system recognizes it." "Recognizes you," her mind supplied. They moved with practiced efficiency. Consent forms. Brief explanations she barely registered. She rolled up her sleeve without hesitation, the familiar sting of the needle grounding her in the present. As the tubing filled, she watched her blood begin its slow journey toward him. Again, the room felt unbearably quiet. She focused on Bruno's face, searching for some sign, anything, that he could feel her there. That he wasn't alone in this moment, even if unconsciousness kept him from knowing it. "You always show up when it matters," the doctor murmured, more to himself than to her. Priscilla didn't answer. She stayed. Time blurred. She drifted in and out of a strange, suspended awareness, half attuned to the steady rhythm of the machines, half lost in memory. The first flight. The gala. The way she'd walked away with her dignity intact, but her heart fractured. The machine beeped once, sharply, then steadied. The doctor leaned closer to the monitors, eyes narrowing. A nurse whispered something under her breath. "His vitals are improving," the doctor said cautiously. Priscilla exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the hospital blanket. When Bruno stirred, it was almost imperceptible, a tightening of fingers, a faint shift of breath. Priscilla leaned forward instinctively, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "Bruno," she whispered. His eyelids fluttered. It took him a moment to focus. When he did, his gaze locked onto hers with startling clarity. "You came back," he said hoarsely. "Yes," she replied simply. His fingers twitched weakly, then curled around hers. "I knew you would," he said. The certainty in his voice undid her. Later, how much later she couldn't tell. The room emptied. The doctor spoke quietly with Isabella's legal team outside. Nurses adjusted machines, then left them alone again. For the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between Priscilla and Bruno felt intimate rather than oppressive. "I owe you an explanation," Bruno said. She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything." "That's not true," he said, "and I won't insult you by pretending it is." He took a breath, steadying himself. "Chase Caldwell orchestrated the leak," he said. "The framing, the timing. He'd been trying to undermine the medical division for months." Priscilla listened without interrupting. "He pushed the narrative that the technology needed a human face," Bruno continued. "When the flight happened, he seized the opportunity. Fed selective information to investors, into the press." "You let it happen," she said quietly. "Yes," he admitted. "Because I believed the truth would protect you." Her jaw tightened. "I was wrong." Silence stretched between them. "There's more," he said. "The scholarships. The research initiatives." She looked at him startled. "What scholarships?" Bruno smiled faintly. "I named them after you, quietly, before everything fell apart." Her breath caught. "Medical access programs, blood donation research, emergency transfusion tech in remote regions," he said. "Not because of the flight, because of you." She stared at him. "You don't get to rewrite this now," she said. "You don't get to make me feel better with philanthropy." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth." He squeezed her hand weakly. "You were never a test case," he said. "You were the reason." The words settled slowly, painfully. "You inspired me," he continued. "Your clarity. Your refusal to calculate compassion. Everything I built after that. Every decision. I kept asking myself whether it would pass the standard you set." Tears welled in her eyes again, unbidden. "I love you," he said simply. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were honest. Priscilla closed her eyes. She thought of Isabella's calm dismissal, of the way the world had reduced her to a headline, of the self she had almost lost trying to remain untouched by power. She thought of the quiet town she'd fled to, of the peace she'd tasted there. I can walk away, she said softly. I've already proven that. I know, Bruno replied. That's why this is your choice. He met her gaze fully now, so vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. I won't ask you to stay, he said. I'll ask you to fight. With me. As my equal. Or not at all. The room held its breath. Priscilla looked down at their joined hands, at the faint bruise forming on her arm where the needle had been. Blood didn't lie. It carried memory. Sacrifice. Truth. She lifted her head. I'm tired of running, she said. Bruno's eyes searched her face. What does that mean? It means, she said steadily, if I stay on my terms. A smile broke across his face, soft, disbelieving. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. Priscilla squeezed his hand. She chose him. The first thing that changed was silence. Not the absence of noise. There was still the low murmur of machines, the shuffle of nurses, with the steady rhythm of a hospital learning how to breathe again, but the silence of conflict. The tension that had coiled itself around every moment began to loosen, slowly, reluctantly, as if uncertain whether it was truly safe to let go. Bruno recovered in measured steps. Strength returned before confidence did. His body healed faster than his trust in it. Priscilla noticed the way he sometimes paused before standing, the way his hand would rest briefly against the edge of the bed, as though reminding himself that he was still here. She stayed. Not constantly, not in the dramatic, self-erasing way she once feared, but intentionally. She learned the rhythm of his recovery, the limits he refused to admit, the moments when humor masked fear, and he learned in turn how to ask rather than assume. The second thing that changed was truth. It arrived not with an apology tour or a press conference, but with documents. Chase Caldwell's name surfaced quietly at first, threaded through internal investigations and regulatory filings. Emails emerged, timelines aligned. The leaks were traced, the manipulation mapped with clinical precision. It became clear that the scandal had not been an accident of proximity, but a strategy of erosion, one designed to destabilize trust from within. The board acted swiftly. Chase was removed before the story reached the public again. His departure was announced in neutral language, his influence erased from the narrative with the same efficiency he'd once used to insert himself into it. Priscilla read the announcement on her phone while sitting beside Bruno's bed. That's it? She asked. That's it, he said. Or power doesn't always fall loudly. She nodded, feeling no satisfaction, only relief. Isabella Torres did not visit immediately. Weeks passed before she appeared again, this time alone. No assistants, no entourage. Just a woman who had built her life on control, now standing at the edge of a room where she had none. Priscilla was there when she entered. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Isabella stopped a few steps inside the doorway, her gaze moving from her son to Priscilla, then back again. You look stronger, she said to Bruno. I am, he replied simply. Silence stretched between them. Then Isabella turned to Priscilla. You did not disappear, she said. No, Priscilla replied. I didn't. Isabella studied her for a long moment, long enough that Priscilla felt the familiar urge to brace herself. But the judgment she expected never arrived. Instead, Isabella inclined her head. I was wrong, she said quietly. The words hung in the air, fragile and rare. I believed distance would protect my son, Isabella continued. I did not account for what absence costs. Priscilla said nothing, I will not pretend to understand your choices, Isabella said, but I see their outcome. Her gaze flicked briefly to the IV stand, the monitors, the man in the bed who was alive because Priscilla had returned. That is sufficient. It was not an apology, but it was an opening. Priscilla accepted it for what it was. The humanitarian initiative launched 6 months later, not under Bruno's name alone, not as a corporate vanity project, but as a partnership, carefully structured, deliberately transparent, designed to outlive both of them. Was mobile blood donation units, emergency transfusion technology deployed in regions where infrastructure failed more often than it functioned. Scholarships for students pursuing medical logistics and public health, quietly funded, quietly sustained. Priscilla oversaw the implementation. Not because she was symbolic, but because she was qualified. Bruno watched from the side more often than the center now, learning how to lead without occupying every space. At the first public blood drive, the line wrapped around the block. Priscilla stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers, answering questions, smiling in that focused way she had when she was fully in her element. The hum of voices and movement grounded her, reminding her of how much she loved work that mattered. She wore the airplane pin on the lapel of her jacket. It's not as a trophy, as a reminder. Nearby, Bruno spoke quietly with a group of donors, his demeanor calm, attentive. When their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, choice, renewed daily. On a table near the registration desk sat a small glass case. Inside it, a vial. Engraved simply, a B negative. Priscilla paused before it, fingers brushing the glass. Blood didn't lie. It carried memory. It carried consequence. It carried survival. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the last chair was folded away, Priscilla and Bruno stood alone in the empty space. You could have walked away, he said softly. I almost did, she replied. But you didn't. No, she said. I stayed. Why? He asked. She considered the question, smiling faintly. Because dignity isn't preserved by distance, she said. It's preserved by choice. He reached for her hand. They stood there for a moment, the echoes of the day lingering like warmth in the air. What survived was not the scandal, not the power, not the narrative others tried to write for them. What survived was this. 2 people who refused to be reduced. A love that did not require erasure. A future chosen, not inherited, not imposed. Priscilla slipped the airplane pin from her lapel and turned it once in her fingers before fastening it back in place. Some connections, she had learned, were written deeper than words. They were written in blood. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And please, comment the city you're watching from. Every single interaction helps us keep bringing you stories that matter. Thank you for staying until the end.